is why is Finland in... Stop putting Finland in Russia. You make the Finns very upset. You don't want to make the Finns upset. We're going to talk about Whatifalthist, who's everyone's favorite clown. And his how would World War III be fought? And I gotta tell you, this thumbnail map is not giving me confidence to begin with. For some strange reason, Finland is listed as part of Russia and China and all of Southeast Asia and the Middle East, and India, who has an incredibly close partnership with Russia militarily, is listed as on the side of NATO, I guess, and Switzerland is excluded, which is heartening. Let's get into it. It's short, mercifully.
It's funny having run this show for what's going to be 9 years soon. God, I can't believe this is my life. I make predictions at the future, and then I see whether or not they actually play out. Something that's really...
They don't play out, just as a spoiler.
Really horrifying is that in a lot of different cases, it's even worse than I imagined it would be. A little over 2 years ago, I made a video about how World War III would play out today and who would win. However, in the time since, history as it has happened has totally changed my view on this topic. I still completely respect the opinion.
History as it has happened is why is Finland in... Stop putting Finland in Russia. You make the Finns very upset. You don't want to make the Finns upset. He's including BRICS countries in part of Russia, which is probably not wise militarily as a prediction.
Opinions I said back then, since they were reasonable, but things have since been proven to be different. However, the possibility of war...
Then your predictions weren't good.
...war still hangs over all of us. This is a video to look into the topic and see what would happen if the bloodiest war in history were to take place in our time. Who would win, what would the front lines be like, and more. The answer might control the fate of our lives. Despite all the talk of drones and robots, conventional warfare is still mostly fought with tanks and planes, the most reliable weapons of war. These are excellent machines, and now you can take command of them in the epic online game. I'm gonna look into the
My opinion of War Thunder just dropped dramatically.
Immersive experience. I really the video. This video isn't gonna look into the causes or probability of having a major war. I already have a video about that. With this video, we're just going to start with the assumption that war has already started, and then we'll see what happens from there. The Chinese have a large alliance structure that encapsulates...
But okay, here's a problem. Right off the bat, the causes of a war are infinitely more important to determining who is fighting that war than any other factor. So let's take an example from World War I. The Central Powers are opposing the Triple Entente in World War I. The Central Powers end up being comprised of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. But they're not called the Central Powers because the Ottoman Empire is included. The Ottoman Empire wasn't part of the calculation. The original alliance was Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Italy. Italy sits out when the war starts and doesn't come in until 1915 on the other side. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany bring the Ottomans in same year, completely out of left field, surprising the crap out of the British. So just because you have a signed treaty does not necessarily mean that someone is going to take your side. And why is this? It's because Italy wants territory controlled by Austro-Hungary, and they're not going to get it if Germany wins the war.
The region of the former Mongol Empire. Their biggest ally is Russia, as well as the Central Asian states and Iran. A point we'll tease out here is that
Why bring up the Mongol Empire if you're actually going to exclude Mongolia?
this is a pretty weak alliance, all things considered. Only
And you're inflating it by several times its actual size. Like, Iraq? No. Pakistan? They're, at the moment... Well, actually, Pakistan's about 5 seconds away from turning into a civil war. But for the moment, they are a semi-unreliable American ally.
built around dislike of the American world order. The Russians and Chinese, by all accounts, ought to be enemies more than allies. They nearly fought a war 40 years ago, and there's a significant branch of Chinese nationalists that literally want to conquer Siberia. At the same time, Muslim governments are trying to form their own caliphate and don't really like the Chinese, given they're genociding the Uyghurs. However, since they share a common enemy, that being the Americans, they are working together. The American coalition is the European Union, or America's allies in NATO, and the countries around the Asian Rim, like Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, India, the Gulf Arabs, Turkey.
What is this map? Why is America, Canada... Like, you would initially think that the dark blue is NATO countries, which it would have been reasonable to put in. Again, you're not using the borders of Finland. Why is Australia included in NATO? Australia, or at least the coloring for NATO. I wish you'd label his maps. God damn it. Yeah, Muslim governments don't seem to care much about the situation in China with the Uyghurs. They're far too busy killing their own people. New Zealand's going to be very upset too.
Maritime Southeast Asia and Oceania. This has more ideological unity than the Chinese coalition, since there aren't as many squabbles over shared borders, and they have a common democratic system and fear of China.
Turkey and Greece beg to differ.
There's no one in the American alliance structure who looks like they want to declare war on anyone else in it.
Turkey and Greece beg to differ.
Interestingly, you can overlay the former Mongol Empire or treatment of women 200 years ago with the current borderlands of these two alliances.
Why is that interesting? What does that actually say? Yes, the US and Canada have become one country. It's now the United States of Canada. Yeah, Iran is not setting up any kind of caliphate. They are also very firmly in Russia's camp because they're making a ton of money, and I suspect they want Russia to replace their F-14s.
I'm not here to talk about what could start a war like this. There's a ring of fire around the Asian continent, including Ukraine, Syria, the Chinese-Indian borderland in the Himalayas, Pakistan, or Taiwan. However, there are some things that make me very, very worried.
Okay, so let's assume India and Pakistan is a good place. That does not necessarily mean that it becomes a world war. Like, you have to establish what's going to happen.
The first thing is that China has literally done everything it would do if it were to invade Taiwan. They stockpiled several years of food, oil, iron, and all other necessities. They literally said they were going to invade Taiwan, and they massed their army and naval forces to do so last year. They also pushed anti-American and anti-Indian rhetoric.
The People's Liberation Army Navy does exercises against Taiwan routinely. It's not a special thing.
to a fever pitch where they told their nation literally to prepare for war. It's kind of funny where I and a friend who's a CEO who runs a geopolitics consulting firm predicted that the Chinese would attack Taiwan last spring because all of it just added up, but then they just didn't. The US military thinks China is aiming to attack Taiwan.
Yeah, that's because they saw exactly what happened to Russia.
Sometime around 2025. Also, I'm shocked Pakistan has not experienced a civil war yet. I've heard that prices for basic stuff like food, oil, and more have gone up 4 to 10 times over in the area around Pakistan. They had horrible flooding last summer, which I also expected to break them, but again, I was wrong. I don't lie to you on this show, and I like to say that this job of predicting the future...
Is it Greg he's talking about? Yeah, Greg! For context, we went over it in a previous Whatifalthist video on my channel. He referenced his friend Greg as a source once.
Is betting against God, given there are about a million ways to be wrong and only a handful to be right. If we want to continue this topic...
And I'd like to congratulate Whatifalthist on finding every single way to be wrong. Wouldn't the US, Korea, and Japan defend Taiwan? Yes, actually, also Australia. To the point that the Japanese constitution has been amended to allow for the deployment of military forces for the first time since World War II. To celebrate, Japan is building themselves a couple convertible helicopter carriers from which they can launch planes, and they're also building two 20,000-ton frigates. They're also building two 20,000, to reference. The largest warship in the world is the largest non-carrier warship in the world is a Russian's Kirov class battle cruiser. It is 28,000 tons. It's like there's two Rudyards speaking at once.
Me and 3 other people...
What's broken?
Who do this kind of predicting professionally thought that they're...
How's that? That sound better? Actually, Billy, I believe he's 21 years old, and he has half a semester of college underneath him. Let me know if this echo stopped.
Be a financial crash last November and October independently. I guess we're either wrong or this is the era of the cheapest money ever has resulted in processes that basically have to happen are taking longer than people would expect, operating off a historical precedent since we're the outlier.
I have talked about this extensively with Whatifalthist videos in the past. He is very, very fond of these concepts of historical cycles. Historical cycles are total nonsense. You'll see a couple of them he references a lot. He turns around and says every 20 years you expect a conflagration in the English-speaking world, and then he starts listing off a bunch of events in a block of text. The problem with these things is you can come to any conclusion you want on a historical cycle. Yes, Spengler too. On a historical cycle by changing what events you include in your analysis. So it is entirely dependent upon what is the author is determining is relevant. Is the Theory Fund still alive? That is a Sunday stream system. What you can do instead of the Theory Fund is you can go subscribe to Two Guys Talking History over up at the pinned comment or in the description box below. Do you get anything? No, but it makes me happy.
However, where this is leading me is, let's imagine an example where China invades Taiwan and or Pakistan falls into a civil war which India intervenes in, thus provoking a war with China. For the sake of the scenario,
India is very already, and he would know this if he paid attention, already opposed to China. They're not going to fall into a situation where they intervene in Pakistan. What will happen is they've had border disputes with China like 3 times in the past 20 years, where both the Chinese and Indian militaries got mauled by each other.
America also gets involved in this war, even though I don't think that's a given. And then, what happens after? I don't think a nuclear war is on the table. I explain why in my
We are not giving away a PS5. I don't even have a PS5.
video on nuclear war. However, the Chinese only have 300 nukes while the Americans have 6,000. The Chinese literally have a no-nuke policy, and given they have 4 times America...
China does not have a no-nuke policy. What China has is a minimum credible deterrence policy. So this is contrasted by America's and Russia's nuclear policy of mutually assured destruction. China has the minimum number of nuclear weapons they think is required to convince people not to invade them, because they can fire off enough to wipe out your 5 or 6 biggest cities. You want a PS5, Lucy? You're gonna have to pry it out of my cold dead hands. Yes, we need more patrons to do PS5 giveaways, like a lot more. As opposed to Russia and the United States, who have a very vast nuclear arsenal divided into 3 legs. A land-based contingent, which is ICBMs in silos running up from Colorado, theoretically, to North Dakota. And this is enough firepower to wipe out everybody. And then we have submarine-based missiles, which we can move around, and they're on submarines, so you can't find them. Again, each one of those submarines carries 20 missiles on it, which in turn have about 2 to 3 warheads. So that's 60 warheads right there. And there's about 16 of those submarines. And finally, you have an air force with strategic strike capability. And the idea for Russia and the United States is, even if you take out all of the missiles of one leg of the triad, you still have enough missiles to wipe the guy out on the other 2 legs. I imagine dropping a nuke on an invading naval force is a pretty big deterrent as well. Well, so that comes into play like things like amphibious invasions. So, like, the example for that in popular fiction is the invasion at Normandy, where you have these fleets of landing craft coming into the beach, right? Nuclear weapons makes that a really unviable strategy, or even just regular cruise missiles. Pinpoint precise standoff strike capability. So now, instead of that, amphibious invasions are conducted from sea to helicopter to shore. So, like, the paradigm of World War II is long over.
America's population and a significantly larger industrial base means that they're incentivized to wage a conventional war. Meanwhile, the U.S. will not want to genocide.
This is again not a very, very poor understanding of nuclear strategy.
Hundreds of millions of Chinese unprovoked. And also, the US is so geographically removed from the main area of war that things won't get real enough that it has to go for nukes in order to keep itself safe. I also don't think Russia would get involved in the war. This is something I've changed from the previous video. As said before, Russia and China are not strong allies, and the Chinese really have not supported the Russians in their invasion of Ukraine. A reason some people have for this is why the Chinese did not attack Taiwan like people expected was that they thought the Russian invasion of Ukraine would win within a month.
The Russians losing in Ukraine is one of the most embarrassing events in world history. Dude, Russian military history is all embarrassing events. Endless amounts of embarrassing events. If they were half competent, they would win in a week. No, they wouldn't. So, Two Guys Talking History is a joint work between myself and another historian, Hetman. Hetman is actually a scholar of Ukrainian studies and the Holocaust in Ukraine. He was, up until the point where the invasion happened about 3 weeks before, in Ukraine working in an SBU archive on Holocaust research. We talked extensively prior to the war breaking out, or at least expanding, in February of 2022, about what might happen. And I repeatedly made a prediction that Russia would not invade because they were not capable of winning this war. And as it turned out, I was absolutely half correct. Russia is not capable of winning this war. However, no one told the Russians this.
Month, which is what almost everyone thought, and the Russians very embarrassingly didn't and are still fighting the war. At the same time, the Middle Eastern front, with countries like Iran and Russia as allies,
Okay. Why? At least this map is labeled. Yes, this would be an incredibly disgusting, simplistic map of Middle Eastern politics. There are Kurdish factions, or at least there were Kurdish factions in Syria. They're having a hard time in Turkey and Syria these days. Iran, no. The Taliban, I assume, is supposed to be Afghanistan, which is basically one and the same now. However, that's not Afghanistan by any stretch of the imagination. He's trying to set up an yeah, like this goes beyond disgustingly simplistic into wrong. Egypt is not conquered. It's just supposed to be into the Saudi sphere of influence, which again isn't correct. Yeah, no, they're still standing. This is not right at any length. It'd make a Middle Eastern studies scholar go nuts.
such as Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and more, they're not close enough with the Chinese to start a war with them over this. This is not to say the Middle East won't have wars for other reasons in the near future. Especially a coming potential agricultural crisis could cause incredibly horrible...
The agricultural crisis is only a crisis if the Russian Navy can enforce its blockade. And so far, the answer seems no. The Russian Navy has suffered two very embarrassing setbacks in the Black Sea in the last couple days. One of their LST landing ship tanks was heavily damaged, and a tanker was also heavily damaged and forced to withdraw from blockade and shipping concerns.
Horrible wars in this area, but it won't be pushing a Chinese agenda. This means that this war will be constricted to the eastern half of Asia, which, don't get me wrong, would still easily make it the bloodiest war in history by several times over, but is less of a world war and might, in a couple centuries...
Why would it be a more bloody war than World War II?
...or years be called the Chinese War or the Great Asian War? This would fit in a lot of ways, since in its stage of industrialization, nationalism, and demographic...
Similarities between Asia today and Europe before World War I. I love these spalls of text. Large youngish populations, not true. A single industrial behemoth bent on conquest that everyone allies... What are you talking about? Germany in World War I is allied with Austria-Hungary. Russia is allied with France and Great Britain. The complicated alliance structure isn't really the same thing either. Like, that's making an awful lot of assumptions, like I said earlier, about who actually intervenes in a war.
This eastern half of Asia is in a very similar position to how Europe was during its world wars.
Except it's not.
The first is in Korea, where the Chinese are allies with the North Koreans. In sheer number, China and North Korea are two of the top three largest militaries in the world. Thus, a truly massive weight of human flesh would smash down the Korean peninsula. The land between the North Korean border and South Korean capital of Seoul, which is a mega city, is a dead flat plain, which would thus probably turn the city into a wasteland and a Stalingrad-like horrible meat grind.
Actually, there is no way in hell that North Korea gets across the demilitarized zone. Actually, the Chinese Navy is the Wish.com version of the American Navy. What they do is they copy American designs and make their own ships, or they buy Russian ships and retrofit them. The North Korean army is not getting across the demilitarized zone. They will run out of will long before we run out of mines. What will happen is that Seoul is well within range of about 9,000 North Korean guns. So it will be a catastrophic factor, but they won't see any army advance through there.
Of house-to-house warfare that might even determine the course of the war. I think the South Koreans could hold on, moving their capital to Busan in the southeast, due to their skinny peninsula, mountainous terrain, superior weapons, training, military doctrines, and how...
So there's an old adage from popular history. A quote from Stalin: "Everything, a quality or quantity has a quality all of its own." Statistically speaking, in military history, this is completely untrue. Technology, superior technology, wins out every time. The idea that you're going to overrun a force with bodies is just false. It's patently false.
Having American troops on the ground. The American military strategy, which our allies also share, prioritizes firepower, which is the best tactic for a defensive campaign, thus meaning that I think South Korea would survive.
If you're talking about the utilization of artillery and air power, it's actually a phenomenal tactic for offensive actions. Because he can't read. Of course he doesn't know it's Busan. Look, you can call artillery strikes on an advance position. As a matter of fact, pretty much any NATO officer worth their salt will pre-plan artillery attacks as part of a coordinated attack, and be able to adjust them on the fly. Like, getting into some minutia here. Here's kind of a thing. There are 360 degrees in a circle, right? In between each degree of a circle, the military teaches you to use something called mills, and there are 5 of these in between each degree. A mill lets you minutely correct artillery fire in between the points of degrees. Like, American artillery is devastatingly accurate.
You have to remember that this is a country that has fought off around 10 Chinese invasions so far in its history. One of the things that's really, really...
I don't necessarily think I'm going to count medieval and ancient invasions in a calculation of this situation.
Talking at the Ukraine war, which is a great view of how modern wars might be fought in the future, in the same way the American Civil War or the Russo-Japanese War were ways to figure out how World War I would be fought, is the war in Ukraine's not fought that dissimilarly to World War II, which is absolutely...
It is absolutely fought dissimilar to World War II. It's fought actually more akin to World War I.
Absolutely nuts, because if you look at the history of modern warfare, periods like 80 years will almost always see incredibly rapid shifts in how war...
And the reason it's fought like World War I is because neither side can gain air superiority. RUSI reports from about 8 months ago indicate the difficulties with gaining air superiority in Ukraine. And this has, and me and Hetman will be going over this fairly comprehensively, probably this coming week as we do our monthly Ukraine update. The lack of ability to suppress enemy air defenses and air power is what is hampering Ukraine's efforts at the moment.
Wars are fought. But my understanding of the war in Ukraine is it's still similar tactics to World War II, with tank offensives and infantry fighting And, for example, I thought drones or rockets might completely revolutionize the battlefield, but it seems to have not.
He is not reading reports from Ukraine where drones have completely revolutionized the battlefield. And rocket artillery has been a thing for 80, 90 years now. Now they're really, really accurate. Again, don't bet against American artillery, you lose.
On the other hand, trying to predict military technology is up there for founding new religions for jobs that are most difficult to do right.
It's not really, actually. You'll notice me and the commander do it all the time in the cathedral.
Precedent for predicting how future wars will be fought is extremely bad. The best technique is often just to believe the opposite of what the consensus view is. And I guess that's how things worked out, because the consensus among futurists and thinkers was that the next war would be purely push buttons with drones or fought remotely, while the reality...
You're confusing Starship Troopers with real life.
...is that the war in Ukraine, or similar wars in Armenia, have been very much conventional on-the-ground wars. Next, we move on to Taiwan, which the Chinese have clearly marked as their big centerpiece, and even largely the reason for the war. They see it as the reconquest of their lost province. This war brings out all sort of fascinating new technologies. I've heard the Chinese have the ability to jam satellite signals, blacking out the South Chinese Sea of American surveillance. Also, the Chinese have massive amounts of rockets and bunkers along the South Chinese coast to deny Americans access to the Taiwan Strait. One of the biggest and most profound
Good luck.
shifts in my thinking on this war since the last version of this video has been my rapid collapse in respect for Chinese institutions. I don't think the Chinese would be able to take over Taiwan, which I said they would easily do in the last video, simply since I don't think their military or organizations are capable enough. In the last video, I said it would be a toss-up on how effective the Chinese military might be, and it had the potential to be very effective. However, when I made that video at the end of 2020, the last thing we heard about China was that they had dealt with COVID very efficiently. That wasn't that funny. However, right now the tables have really turned. China is barely a functional country today. China
hasn't been a functional country for 40 years. They're very good at putting on a nice show. They have a lukewarm military development project. Yeah, futurism hasn't, again, a thing since post-World War II either. That's where, satire and the new French existentialists come from, is that specific rejection of futurism. And you have Elon Musk, who is kind of a fake futurist now.
Really believe and would bet good money that they will have a massive revolution over the next 5 years. You can see this in their COVID lockdowns, in which they shut down and
you don't see that in COVID lockdowns, incidentally, because they're not revolting. What's going to happen is China has a much better chance of balkanizing into several countries, particularly based on the much wealthier seaboard versus the rural interior.
Internal trade, thus resulting in millions of people going hungry and close to starvation, and not letting farmers grow their crops or welding people into their homes. You can see lots of indirect evidence for incompetence.
People were not welded into their home. What is this? I'm sorry, I knew this was going to be a thing.
That ranges between an inability to actually execute these COVID lockdowns, stockpiles they've been trying to make to prepare for whatever crisis they expect, are often rotting, unusable, or just not even there.
Citation needed.
I'm not saying America's perfect here, but the Chinese are in much worse condition than America, in my opinion, and also more is expected of China because they have to wage an offensive war while the US largely has to wage a defensive one secondarily through its allies. In a society, the normal level of social functioning is broadly indicative of how well the military works. You can find...
It absolutely isn't. What? No, it absolutely isn't. Military functions can be highly cut off from society. You can have very effective militaries without necessarily well-functioning societies. That's basically all of Africa.
No countries with extremely dysfunctional cultures into amazing militaries, or vice versa, since the military is a representation of the society. Also, it's not like the People's Liberation Army was ever considered a beacon for efficiency and fairness. Selling officers missions is a decently common thing, as is them having their own massively bloated military industrial complex that makes ours look great. The Chinese Navy has gone on a massive building binge that you'll get these incredibly embarrassing stories of Chinese crews being completely incapable of manning or sailing the ships, or them being maintained in horrible conditions. The final thing you need to wage...
I have not heard those stories of the Chinese Navy. There is no reason to assume that these ships can't be sailed, because they are sailing routinely through the South China Sea.
War is to be able to feed young men ideas that make dying for their country worthwhile. However, China...
If your reference is Sabaton again, I'm going to lose it.
...also fails here. Xi Jinping, China's leader, has been trying desperately to move China back to Maoism, as he modestly calls it, Xi Jinping thought. This involves kicking the foreign journalists out of China, preventing Chinese from studying abroad or studying foreign languages, and turning China's educational system to prepare young men for war and propagandize them, and have women make children. However, it's going to be impossible to turn the Chinese back to communism after they've seen capitalism. Communism is not that powerful in China. What the Chinese generally want is a strong and prosperous China, and nationalism is a much more potent...
Good luck getting anything done in China without the approval of the Chinese Communist Party. This is ridiculous.
Tool. Xi is almost certainly trying to move back to Maoism, given he imagines there, or at least a major crisis, and he wants the Chinese to act with fanaticism and carelessness for life that they had under Mao. However, communism's vigor as an ideology has been completely spent. Everyone knows the communist utopia is not going to happen except for delusional academics. With all this going on...
The academics who failed you out of college, those academics, because I think they made some good choices.
We've seen China fall into riots, with the largest since Tiananmen Square. The average Chinese person lives a not great life, often in an apartment the size of a horse stall, working 12-hour days with no chance to have children or save up for old age. I'm not saying the West is an especially good place either. The West is doomed to mass social instability. However, it will not be as bad or as soon as it will be in China. China can't afford to wage a long and bloody war, since it will simply have another revolution. Also, China's demographic problems, in which it has far more old people than young people, mean that it can't afford to lose lots of young people either. And also, if a single Chinese man dies, his entire ancestral family line is dead too. And as a culture that cares as much about family as China, that's going to be crippling for their social model.
Huh? Why is that? Okay. What? Let's go back a hot second there.
Single Chinese man dies, his entire ancestral family line is dead too. And as a culture that cares as much about family as China, that's going to be crippling for their social...
Okay. First of all, there is no guarantee of that statement at all, because guess what? You might have brothers, sisters, not so much in China, but like cousins who carry on an ancestral legacy. You have relationships outside of
model and create mass discontent. Another factor is that the Chinese don't have the ability to ship oil and food by land, which they need. The Americans are the most powerful navy in the world and would blockade China, and that's the only Chinese route to get oil from its sources in the Middle East is overland. However, we live in an era in which a giant food crisis is approaching, which will result in making Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran all the areas in between them and the oil.
You haven't proven a food crisis. Also, China's new Silk Road is being built and probably going to be successful.
Incapable of hosting a Chinese rail line. At the same time, this would require one of the greatest engineering projects in history that the Chinese have not yet completed.
But is underway.
Chinese only have a couple years to fight this war before their food and oil supplies run out. However, that assumes the Chinese will be able to wage this war efficiently.
All right, guys, I think I figured it out. He patterned this off of a Hearts of Iron mod.
Which they probably will not. This will create conditions like Russia in World War I, which was also experiencing horrible resource shortages, which also caused a revolution. One of the things I've just recently come to terms with is that the crisis of the 21st century has more to do with traditional social structures breaking down due to societal pressures than any real aggressive force, and this is going to happen everywhere in the world. However, this will mean that all the Chinese's main offensives, including Taiwan, will be failures. Taiwan is incredibly small.
What main offensive? You have posited a single offensive.
Compared to China, but there are a couple important factors that can allow the Taiwanese to survive. The first is that amphibious invasions are incredibly difficult in the modern world and have only been successfully done a handful of times, in each case under extremely positive odds for the attackers, which the Chinese would struggle to get in Taiwan due to US support. The Chinese military is
Amphibious invasions are remarkably common. Particularly with the new changes in doctrine I talked about earlier, and they're almost always successful. You'll jump in a helicopter and you fly in, and then you get off the helicopter. Yay, you've won!
It's also very scaled, and the island is mountainous, jungly, and urban, which is the worst.
Also, Russia's revolution was not caused by resource shortages. It was caused by...
In my last video, I said the Chinese would be able to conquer Vietnam through using their allies in Laos and Cambodia.
Vietnam would probably have something to say about that. Vietnam had beat, in short order, the Japanese, the French, the French, and the Americans in a course of 40 years. China's not going to be much more successful.
Us around it. It's kind of ironic how America and communist Vietnam are now strong allies, but they are. However, now I don't think the Chinese will be able to pull that off, and they would lose.
How are they strong? Never mind.
Vietnam. This fits in with the theme of the Vietnamese fighting off 27 Chinese invasions over the last 1,000 years. Finally, the last borderland is India, where if war does break out, it would possibly be the biggest and bloodiest war in history by a significant margin. India and China added together have more people than the whole world during World War II, and both countries are prone to using human wave tactics. However,
neither country is prone to using human wave tactics, but that's okay.
However, this would involve the Chinese vaulting their forces over the Himalaya mountains. These are the highest and most difficult mountains in the world. If the Chinese would be able to...
Okay, you don't... So let's take another comparative military history example. Italy invading Austro-Hungary in 1915, 16, 17, and 18. Mountains are really hard to fight in. As a consequence of the fact that mountains are mountains, you cannot fight in most of mountain positions at all. You have to fight in specific areas. So there are multiple battles, like double-digit battles in World War I in the Alps in the same place, because you literally cannot go anywhere else. And that's what's definitely a product of the Himalayas. So you have a limited number of actual fighting fields, which limits the amount of people you can get in. As a consequence, both India and China have built theoretically highly trained mountaineer fighting forces.
The vault over these mountains, it would be the most impressive construction project in the history of the world. It's always hard with China since they're pretty...
It's ropes. It's rope. Never mind. It's not. Nothing's getting constructed. It's ropes and pitons.
secretive, and I am sadly not privy to all their secret documents, but they were attempting to build a road system to do this a couple years ago, which they didn't finish. Since they are massively pressed, I do not think they are about to complete the most ambitious engineering project in history. The reason I thought it was conceivable in the previous video is that around 2020 they had
Okay, let's assume that you can build a road there. What do you think will happen if you try to go down that road and attack somebody? It'll be pre-sighted for artillery and you die.
incredibly impressive construction abilities that we have not since seen them use. Instead, we'd see them attack India through the jungles in Assam. In this harsh terrain, the Indians would have a clear advantage and win, resulting in the death of millions of Chinese. Lowland jungle environments naturally benefit the Indians who come from a lowlands tropical environment against the mostly temperate Chinese. Thus, we're looking at a war with the Chinese launching large human wave attacks ineffectively in harsh terrain before
Citation needed.
being defeated by the local populations as aided by the Americans. This is a movie we've seen a couple times. Just for a handful of examples: the 18th century Chinese invasion of Burma, the medieval Yuan dynasty invasion of Japan, the 7th century Sui invasion of Korea, the 6th
That a large army exists is not necessarily indicative of the type of tactics being used.
century invasion of Mongolia, or the 15th century invasion of Vietnam. In each of these wars, massive, poorly supplied, led, and trained Chinese armies were wiped out by much smaller native forces. The final
Citation needed.
front in this war is Pakistan. Pakistan is one of China's strongest allies and hates India, thus meaning they would likely try to get involved on China's behalf. The terrain line between China and Pakistan is extremely difficult, and so the Chinese would not be able to send large armies to Punjab. Pakistan and India have already fought several wars, which India has universally
Why?
won easily, and India has advantages over Pakistan in everything, and this gap
I don't think that's strictly speaking true.
has just grown over the last couple decades. I've said before that Pakistan's ostensibly a mess, and I am completely shocked that they have not fallen apart as a functioning country by this point. However, they would be unable to maintain the shock of a war with India and even be able to feed their population, honestly. I could see the Hindu nationalist government, which is in charge in India and has been looking to reunify the subcontinent, conquer Pakistan up to the Indus River, which has been India's natural boundary for most of its history, and then they let the Taliban take the rest of the country. This leads to the next point where, as I said in the previous video about if we'll have a world war, that if
India's not about to let the Taliban take over anything.
we have a major war now, it won't be like the previous world wars of 100 years ago. Something like the 30 Years' War or the 100 Years' War makes a lot more sense. In the previous world wars, they were fought by energetic, very young, demographically
Why are you proposing World War III if you don't think world wars will be fought?
industrializing countries. In situations like this, societies almost act like rockets, just pushing out, fighting very aggressive wars. World wars are demographic ejaculations. However, the similarities between what a
What? What does that even mean? Demographic ejaculation. Okay, we're almost done.
war would be like in our times in the 100 or 30 Years' War is that they're fought by countries going through demographic crises, which I talk about in these videos. They were fought by countries facing the same problems we have now of high inequality, political
Explaining secular crises. That's not how you spell crises, is it? Yeah, no one likes hearing him say the word ejaculation. That's why he can't find a date. Oh, he actually spelled that right. An era of stability happens. The population grows and society becomes wealthier. As population gets larger, the value of each individual laborer goes down, and thus the wealth is concentrated in the hands of people who can mobilize labor, just creating inequality. No, not quite. Wealth inequality typically causes available citizen populations to go down. Sparta and Rome prior to the Marian reforms is a pretty good example of that. As inequality gets worse, society loses cohesion. No. The standard of living goes down for normal people while there are more people struggling for good jobs than can fit in them. Again, no. This competition for a few good jobs results in the society splitting into different factions, trying to push their faction to victory so they can succeed. Again, citation needed. These factions cause a civil war. No. Repeat.
Polarization, social collapse, or economic hardship.
This is like Marx if he fell out of a tree and hit every branch on the stupid tree on the way down.
These aren't societies bursting with energy, but rather ones that are desperately waging wars in order to maintain their internal social stability. In both the 100 Years' War and 30 Years' War, all the major countries involved were fighting civil wars by the time the wars ended. If we fight a major war in our time, it will...
That had very little to do with anything about social cohesion and everything to do with political factions developing due to the opportunities created by Protestantism in Europe.
Be like this. I expect every major country in the equation, whether the US, India, China, Pakistan, and the others, to have a major internal crisis that will pull them out of the war for part of it. A war of the one-eyed. The 100 Years and 30 Years' War are less based off giant Götterdämmerung battles like Stalingrad or Verdun, and more so about...
Never use that word again.
Gradually trying to break down the other side's ability to fight and wage war economically or socially at all. For example, the English government's inability to pay its debts in the 100 Years' War during the 14th century caused a financial crisis that broke the European economy, and the exact same thing happened with the world economy and the Spanish in the 17th century. A situation where the US or China defaults on its debts, resulting in an economic crisis, sounds a lot like the sort of thing that could happen in our time. What the equivalent of that economic warfare fought in these previous eras would be as cyber or satellite attacks, both of which have the potential to cripple large parts of society if done.
This does not follow. The debt ceiling does not follow cyber attacks.
Incorrectly. In the modern world, people are completely dependent on giant supply trains and on extremely complicated systems, and if those break down, people will start to starve, and people won't be able to get the proper medical care they'll need. If a country can wipe out its opponent's satellites, it can drive them back decades and wipe out communications on the most basic levels. Another similarity in the 30 and 100 Years' War is that they were so long since they weren't a single war, rather 3 or more distinct wars being brought together under a single banner, and every single geopolitical player was involved in these wars. This is the sort of thing that can happen in the modern world due to demographics. Our similarities with these earlier crises is that we have the exact same kind of demographic crisis in which our populations are collapsing. These crises take decades to...
Whose population is collapsing? Get a third grade geography book and you can see that that's false.
Work out as countries try to fight out the new order. The horrible thing of our age is that every major country in the Northern Hemisphere, including Russia, China, the European Union, and Japan, with the exceptions of the US and India, are projected to have their populations go down by over half over the next few decades. This means these countries are going to be fighting a long crisis and a source of instability for a very long time. Meanwhile, Africa and the Middle East are totally dependent on foreign food imports, which can't possibly be maintained, thus creating the firewood for another kind of horrible demographic crisis, one of mass famine. The short answer is that
farming is increasingly automated to the point where you need fewer people to do more work. And seasonal work at that. So that doesn't necessarily track. Also, here's what happens in at least the United States as a cyclical thing. Immigration tends to be less heavily enforced when we need farm workers. Just a thought.
This war will not be as intense as a world war, but similar to other demographic stagnation wars like the 100 Years' War, Crisis of the Third Century, fall of the Roman Republic, Napoleonic, or 30 Years' War. All of
These do not have those similar pieces in common. What? You're just listing events now.
which were fought in different sections over a period of decades. Short answer,
Congratulations, different wars were fought in different places.
expect your sons, and hopefully not your grandsons, to have to fight in the same war as you. I guess the positive is more girls for you if you survive. Sleep tight tonight, boys. Remember to check out War.
No. Just no. All right. We have been going for what? Almost 3 hours. I'm going to shill myself. Yeah, he's getting really creepy. That's not wrong. I'm going to shill myself one final time. You can find me over at Two Guys Talking History. We should be, assuming everything flattens out, doing more Whatifalthist, but there's going to be more of us. It'll be me, Hetman, hopefully Lucy and Emmanuel on Tuesday. And that'll be fun. And probably we'll be drinking. Anyway, other than that, I appreciate everybody showing up today. I wanted to sing you out with the monkey song. Have a good day, everybody.
Like